Hi, welcome to Marking the Role, a podcast for teachers. We're based in the Illawarra, but it's for teachers all over Australia and indeed anywhere. My name's Phil Dye, I'm your host. This is episode 18, the start of season 3. Now, season 3 is going to be a little bit different to season 1 and 2. We've got at least 4, probably 5 episodes, but we may not get to the 8. Mainly because Lee Louise, our producer, has got a real job, so she can't be here as much as she was before. The first 2 are going to be on trauma-informed teaching. Now, I know that teachers are overwhelmed with paperwork, with mandatory training. There's some ridiculous mandatory training. I looked at the list and empowering through data. Let's write an English unit. Oh, what joy. Cybersecurity. We've got something I found called AVID Digital 1XP English COP. Wouldn't have a clue what that means. So we have a lot of mindless stuff. But trauma-informed teaching is so important these days. I came from a traumatic childhood, and the way that my teachers treated me and sometimes catered for me is one of the reasons I went in to teaching. When I was at school, it was my safe place, and the longer I could stay at school meant the less time I had to be at home. And this is the same as many of your students out there. I bet there's also teachers, many of you, who have had a trauma childhood, and it's probably now that you're seeing what the results of that trauma are, because sometimes you only see the results later on in life. Some broad categories of trauma include witnessing, trauma occurring to a loved one, in other words, witnessing domestic violence, having an accident, a severe car accident, the unexpected death of a loved one is traumatic. Physical violence against yourself, of course, that's traumatic. Having a family member who's depressed can cause trauma. Having a family member who's addicted to either substance or gambling, or even having a family member who's in prison. And the definition from Sane Australia says that a traumatic event is something experienced by a person or a group of people as powerful, upsetting, stressing, and or distressing. Now, this is not losing 100 metres race. It's not just getting 60% in an exam. It's not the small stuff that is a normal part of living. Yes, we all have ups and downs, and we've got to get used to it. That's not trauma. That has very little impact, but some has a severe impact and forms brain pathways that are very, very hard to eclipse. And as teachers, you'd probably know that children have certain windows of learning in their development. Say a learning window between 5 and 7 may influence rational decision making. Now, if that trauma pathway has closed that window, it means that child cannot learn those things and develop that ability for rational thought. So it is so important that all of those windows remain open through childhood and not be closed through traumatic experiences. I was an educator in the School of Medical Sciences at the University of New South Wales for several years, and we used electroencephalographs, EEGs, to teach people about the brain, where they could actually see the pathway that was happening inside their head. And I've used this in Teacher PD to illustrate to teachers how it works as well. And it is the science behind trauma that has made trauma-informed teaching such an important thing these days. Now, in this episode, I interview Bec Thompson. Bec Thompson is the author of Chasing Normal. She talks about her traumatic childhood. It is important for listeners to know that trauma can be in all different sorts of ways, and sexual abuse is one of the big ways that young people experience trauma. Now, there is a brain break halfway through the interview. I suggest you get up and have a bit of a bop around and release some of the tension. Next episode, I'll be interviewing Tom Brunzell from the Berry Street Education program, and I'll also be adding some of the last parts of the interview with Beck, so it'll be concluded in the next episode. Now, I thought I'd start the interview with asking Beck to tell us a little bit about her early childhood, between the age of 0 and 6 years old.
Well, it was quite normal and happy and pleasant as I remember it. There was certainly nothing, that created any sort of sense of fear. It was relatively normal. I had a mum and dad and grew up with my 3 other siblings, and I got to play, and it was back in the day when you could sort of play until the street lights came on and then come inside, and we spent a lot of time outside, and I had a fairly connected relationship with my mother. I always felt like there was someone I could go to. So, and my siblings were certainly, they were fun to be around because we're all, so close in age. I think there's, 2.5 years difference between me and my 2 siblings, my older siblings. So, yeah, they were just really lovely memories of playing. And
something happened at around age 6. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so when I was 6, going into grade 2, my parents decided to separate and divorce. I don't remember the details, but my father didn't think that my mum could handle a single life with 4 children under 9. So it was decided that we, my mother, my siblings and I would move into my paternal grandfather's house. And he already had 5 other women and 9 more of his children living there. And life pretty much changed immediately. It went from everything I knew to a completely foreign world where my childhood was pretty much came to a stop.
Did you take anything from your old life, and like books or toys or anything like that?
No, well, that was the really interesting thing was I kind of, when we moved in and we were given a tour of this big house with 20 odd people in it, I was sort of looking for those familiar things that I had in my old home. Even my clothes, I remember opening up the cupboard and wondering where my familiar clothes were. So we weren't actually allowed to take anything. I believe my father actually just turfed them in the bin. Everything that we had, I had dolls, I had teddies, I had books that were favourite books. Absolutely nothing was taken into that house because, despite them being 13 children in the house, you wouldn't have known because there was no play at all. So.
And where did all these 13 children come from?
Well, they were my grandfather's children.
Right, right.
Yeah, so my father is actually the eldest of all the children. So he sort of remarried but then he had, it's pretty like I guess you sort of call it a cult-like experience where he had children to different women in the house. So we were spoken to rather than being able to speak to them. So we knew all their names and who had the power, who had the authority, who didn't have the authority, like my mother. But
it became pretty clear to you straight away that you had to do some hard work in the house. What were some of the tasks that you were given?
Yeah, so pretty much the house revolved around chores. So, and I always think that I got I drew the shortest straw because I seemed to get the jobs that just were the most meaningless to me. Even at that age, I just did not see the point. One of them was to scrub behind the industrial dryer because there were so many of us. and it was probably a couple of inches wide at the back, and so I had to make sure that was clean every morning. And
every morning?
Yes. Everyone had a job. I don't know how dirty it could get in 24 hours, but
No.
because that was always, that was obviously one of the things that stood out to me when I moved into the house, was how everything was so clean, and I soon realised why. It's because it was the children's job predominantly to keep everything completely pristine. So.
And fairly regular church services, but within the house. Is that right?
Yeah. So my grandfather had a specially built little church room at the side of the house, and it was, we had our own pathway to it. The children, we certainly couldn't go through the house because there were two different parts of the house. There was the cold area that the kids were in, and then there was this luxurious side, and the church was on that luxurious side. So we had to walk outside and around. So that's where most of our Sunday sessions were, and then we'd go to another room where we had to then talk again about what the sermon was about. And of course, as children, you can't really take that in anyway. I mean, it was never that interesting listening to Bible passages at 6 or 7 years of age, and then to have to go and analyse it.
Yeah. Yes. Did you ever go outside and go to the shops?
No. So, look, we had the rare Sunday walks. So they were all organised, and we had to stand in line, 2 lines, like we were going to school, because we had to walk to school like that as well. But no, there was nothing really normal about living in that house, except that we got to go to school. So aside from school, I didn't catch up with friends. I didn't go to shops. I wouldn't have been able to tell you what was happening out in the world, because we didn't get to watch TV either. So anything I learnt about what was going on in those years, I would get from my peers at school.
As well as doing the chores, there were other things expected of you in the house as well, weren't there?
Yeah. So there was obviously the most damaging part was abuse. We were, I was certainly subjected to sexual abuse by my grandfather. There wasn't a lot of, obviously, options in that. It was almost expected, so we didn't get a choice in that. It was just something that we were told we had to do. And yeah, there really wasn't much say in that at all, actually.
You mentioned these other women in the house. Now, excluding your mum, do you think that these other women knew what was going on with the abuse from your grandfather?
Yes, I do, because I was often led up to his bedroom by the women, and they were often the ones that were prepping me to go up there, for sure. And it was part of the objective, because everything was about helping my grandfather, know what he's doing and what he wanted, and so they were well informed of what was going on with regards to that, for sure.
So it really adds weight to you calling it a cult. It's very similar to that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. He thought he was God's messenger. He sort of referred to himself as the Messiah. So everything was, his way and what he ordained as the truth. And he's in his mind, he was protecting us all from the devil's playground outside the walls we lived, and everything he was teaching the women and the women were teaching the children was the gospel truth. As far as, obviously the other significant thing was the beatings, just that absolute control of, you could not put a foot wrong. And, it was just, there was no compassion met with mistakes. It was just abuse, it was beatings, it was isolation. And if they didn't feel that you were getting the message, if the message wasn't getting through and you were just this naughty child that could not be redeemed somehow, then probably the most traumatizing for me was that they would get my mother in unknowingly. She wouldn't know what the problem was because she had no say in how I was treated. But they would get her in and make her beat me with no context or anything. And of course, my mother was too afraid to say anything or to put a stop to it. So in that case, it was just a very cruel existence. You just couldn't. You just had to be so acutely aware of not putting a foot wrong, or even just an expression on your face would warrant, going without a meal, because we certainly didn't snack. It was just 3 meals a day, because anything outside of that was greedy. If you're running around at school and you think you're coming home for a snack, as most kids do, it just wasn't a thing. So that was, yeah.
Well, I'm not sure how you're feeling, but I feel like a brain break, something to just release the tension for a while. And we're going to have a brain break from Illawarra band Stunts with their song No Feels. Now, if you really want to have a brain break that does you some good, don't just sit and listen to this one, but get up and bop around. It's a good bop around song. Of course, you can sit with the tension if you like, but if you're driving in the car, just tap the steering wheel, something to get some of the tension out. Illawarra band Stunts with No Feels.
All this down the way.
That was the Stunts with No Feels. Now, it sounds like a full-on band, but there's just two of them, and they do all the music and the singing themselves. It's got a real 80s sound, a little bit like the Doogites, if you ever remember the Doogites, a bit like the Pixies, perhaps, but it's a great sound. Now, if you like them, go to Spotify and just look up Stunts, or you can go to any of the streaming services, or you can go to Marking the Roll, and we've always got a page there for the music that's being played during the podcast. And time to get back to my interview with Rebekah Thompson, author of Chasing Normal, and I asked her if her mother did anything to stop the beatings or the abuse when she was in the house.
No. So, I mean, and she didn't. I think she knew, because she was also badly treated. She was really quite insignificant in that house. I mean, she could have been, see-through. That's what it was like. It was like she was invisible. And, that's one of the things, later on in life you sort of try and think of. I'm a mother myself, and I know what I would instinctively do if that was my child. But for whatever reason, my mother did not do anything until she left. And that was probably the most significant thing that she did that probably saved us in the end. So.
And what age were you when that nightmare ended in the house?
I was 9.5, so it was just before Christmas in 1986, I think.
Right, so it was about 3.5 years being there.
Yeah, pretty much. Mm-hmm.
Now, children who suffer trauma in certain vital brain development windows, let's say between 5 and 8 or 6 and 9 years, often have a knowledge deficit, where what is learned, say, at school, is blocked out, is completely forgotten, or it's distorted. There is something in distorted in it. Did you experience anything like that?
I would say that was predominantly my experience in primary and secondary. I distinctly remember one of my main memories of when I moved into this house, and I was in grade 2. I distinctly remember just feeling this, the room just looked like a blur, and I could hear the teacher, when you're trying to talk underwater, you can hear the sound, but you can't make out the words. And that's my first memory of coming to a new school and a new teacher, and having walked into this new environment, and all of a sudden you're being beaten, you're being controlled, you're being screamed at, and being abused, and then having my mother taken away from me so I couldn't engage or talk to her at all. I distinctly remember just sitting there, just looking around and not really understanding anything. I certainly wasn't taking anything in, but that's pretty much been my predominant experience. Is I don't retain it. I wasn't retaining things. Sometimes I would stare at the teacher just wanting to understand it. Of course, being too afraid to say, I don't get what you're saying, especially if, they're making it clear or they're re-explaining something. You certainly don't want to be that student that says, I still don't get it. So I completely relate to that experience, because I felt like I was just in survival mode. And I think, that sort of just survival coping mechanism of trying to survive what was going on at home, that was more than, that was what I needed to do primarily, than try and take something in at school.
It's important for teachers out there listening that's one of the telltale signs, isn't it, that nothing is going in.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things even teaching now, I'm just so mindful of that children come to school with so much that we do not even realise. We don't know what they've experienced that morning. We don't know what they repeatedly experience, especially if it is abuse or it is violence, witnessing violence, being on the other end of violence. It's and to sort of think they come into school and just click and ready to learn and take it all in and engage, and it's just not going to happen.
No. Now, after you left the house, the abuse didn't stop there, did it?
I wish I could say it did. No. So we went to what my mum hoped was the safe refuge of her parents. So we moved from my father's house to my mother's father's house. And look, it was a couple of months in. It was sort of where I was starting to get all those benefits of being a child again, and I was warming to that slowly of even just having my hair done in pigtails, or being able to eat at my leisure, or talk to my grandmother and go and roam around the farm property that they had with all the various animals, and watching TV and things. So I was certainly learning that, okay, well, this is becoming a safe environment and I can start to relax. But no, unfortunately, my maternal grandfather began abusing me as well. So, sort of automatic shutdown again, that home was not a safe place once again.
Yeah. And when you were about 13 or 14, you decided to do something about it. Mm-hmm. What did you do?
Well, I mean, we'd sort of moved around a few times when we initially moved from the first house, and my mum had decided that she'd found a house to buy back in the same town as her father. And I was a teenager, so I'm becoming increasingly aware of what's happening with my own body, and also acutely aware that my grandfather was still abusing me, and I didn't, I wanted it to stop. It was really weighing on me. I was quite anxious, and so I told someone in the street that I lived in at the time what was happening. It was the first time I'd told anyone, and even though she promised not to say anything, she did the right thing, and she went and spoke to the police, and the police then landed on our new doorstep.
And did your mother support you in it?
No, unfortunately not. She refused to believe it at all. There was no investigation at all. There was no inquiry. There was no, why would you say this? How could you say this? When there was just nothing. It was completely shut down. And that was really the end of it. And
then you realised something about your mother.
Well, I realised I was on my own. I was completely on my own, and that was probably the biggest blow, because it was almost like when we moved into the house when I was 6 and I was on my own, because my mother was there, but she couldn't be there and she wasn't there. But when it got to reporting it and it was all out in the open, and the policewoman sat there and asked me point blank, it was kind of a sliding doors moment. And I knew the risk I was taking by admitting what was happening, but also knowing that this was it. My mum was never going to stand up and support me, and that from that, literally that moment on, I was going to have to deal with this on my own, and all the repercussions around it, because obviously the family, were completely disgusted that I was saying anything like this about my grandfather. So, yeah.
And how were you at school during this time?
Well, this was the start of year 9, and I had already changed schools again, and it was incredibly difficult. I mean, I struggled to relate to my peers anyway. I think I'd been forced to grow up a lot quicker than my peers, so that made making friends even harder. But now I was in a new school. I didn't really know how to find my way with people at school, and certainly the peers of my age group. And I certainly tried, but they were the ones that didn't want to go to school. So, which for me at the time, even though school was my safe place, the group that I got into, they wagged a lot. So it was kind of a perfect opportunity for me to wag with them. So I actually didn't go to school. I probably missed about 50 days, which is quite a lot in year 9, because I just needed to escape. But the only time that I really, year 9 particularly, I was lucky that I had one teacher that really stood out, and that was my English teacher. And he was I just remember he was very caring and supportive teacher, but he really harnessed my strengths. And at the time when, there was nothing but avoidance going on at home, and my mum was really struggling with being this whole situation and being seen as the naughty daughter by her own father, I really latched on to that teacher who could say, hey, I actually see a strength in you. Let's really dive into it and explore it a little bit and bring it to life. And for me, not having that parental compassion or support at home, it was the teacher really filled that void, I think, and kept me going to school. I didn't ever wag on the days I had English, so
right,
because I just needed to see. I needed to be around that teacher because I felt loved. I felt like someone liked me.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, that teacher didn't have to do any, mandatory professional development. They were simply nice to you, listened to you, and saw what you were capable of.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's what's key, is that there's no professional development in this. And he had no idea what I was going through at home, and what had happened, but he had that way that, just brought something out in me that I needed someone to see that there was something about me, because at the time my mum had pretty much shut me down in entirety. I said to someone recently, it's like being an adopted daughter. There was no emotional connection at all. It's like, yes, you're my daughter, but that's where it ends. Whereas
no hugs when you came home from school?
No. Well, you can't. I think once you know where the line in the sand is with your parents, you don't really expect anything. So, my mum had the go-to, how was your day? But, I remember when I walk in every day and my mum would be sitting there, how was your day? And I remember one day thinking, why do you care? I mean, if you don't care about anything that I've been through, and you don't want to support me in that, or at least see how I'm going emotionally, and having to, deal with the fallout at such a young age of my uncles and aunties not wanting anything to do with me, and you really want to know how my day was? Why?
What about your friendships? Did you have friends?
The friendships I had and developed were outside of school. So the town that my mother house that we bought was a very small town, and I had one friend mainly from in that town that I remember she came up to the door one day to go and hang out, and this was after everything had come out, and I I leapt at the opportunity. But I remember telling her because it felt like, well, I couldn't get past that because there was so much going on, and I couldn't, she was such an upbeat, very carefree person, and she, laugh a lot and just want to go and have fun. And, I couldn't do that because I felt like I had the weight of the world on my shoulders, and I couldn't relax enough to want to have fun, and, just too busy trying to hold everything in that I told her what was happening and what had happened, and she turned out to be, an incredible support for me. I mean, she still challenged me to, try and let things, go for the moment and go and have fun and jump in the river and whatnot. But she was, and we're still friends today, 35 years on or so. And she was an incredible support in my life during those particularly difficult years, for sure.
Now, you'll be hearing the last part of my interview with Beck Thompson next week, when I'll also be talking with Tom Brunzell from the Berry Street Education Model. Now, I've got 2 copies of Beck's book, Chasing Normal, to give away. Now, there's 2 ways of winning, but you've got to either donate or become a member of the podcast. You go to the little yellow coffee cup on the markingtheroll.com.au website. There's a little yellow coffee cup. Now, for the first 10 people who donate, and you only have to donate $5. If you donate $5, you go into a draw out of the first 10, and if you win that draw, I'll send you a copy of Beck's book, Chasing Normal. And also, if you become a member. Now, becoming a member is more expensive. It's $20 for the year for a basic membership, but only the first 5 that become members go into the draw, and I'll draw out one of those 5 for a free copy of Beck's book. And don't worry, you'll be notified when that draw has finished. It'll be up on the Buy Me a Coffee site. You've been listening to episode 18, the first of 2 episodes on trauma-informed teaching. Next week, Tom Brunzell will be taking us through some steps as to how to identify students who may have a trauma background, and with COVID in the last 3 years, there's many of them. But this episode was just to give you a glimpse as to the type of trauma that students can experience, and as Beck said, their teachers would never, ever have known. If there's been anything in this podcast that has caused you distress or raised issues, if you're in Australia, you can call Lifeline on 131114, or Beyond Blue on 1300 224636. You've been listening to Marking the Roll. Tell your friends about it, follow us on Facebook, and I'll see you next week.